Ladies and gentlemen, in this Red Gaming Telecom video we're going to be further discussing the PlayStation 4's GPU. A couple of developers have weighed in on the GPU primarily, but also spoken about other parts of the system, so we're going to do a brief analysis on this. Now, you may have heard of the rather pretty looking horror game Dying Light, which is by Techland. They have done a recent interview in which the senior engine programmer, and I'm probably going to pronounce this terribly wrong, but Thomas Zaslowski, I'm hoping I pronounced that correctly, has actually commented on this, specifically on the GPU. He said the PS4 is a truly fantastic piece of hardware. Its high GPU performance comes from the API, also known as Application Programming Interface, just out of quote for a second, which allows a strict control over all processes and facilitates optimization and experimentation. Obviously, with greater control comes greater responsibility. He's obviously citing the Spider-Man mantra there. For example, for corrected synchronization between processing units, a modern GPU, an adequate API, and a unified CPU/GPU address space allows us to develop new algorithms and techniques that simply were not possible before. A shade of Model 5 hardware working with DX11 was limited in terms of capabilities compared to how the hardware actually could perform, and many of those things were beyond the control. Now, the GPU alone is fast enough to not only render high-quality visuals at 1080p, but also take on some of the tasks of the main processor. The first presentation of Dying Light for the PS4 is just a taste of what the Chrome Engine 6 can do for the console. So I'm going to do a brief analysis of this, rather short, but actually quite informative piece of information. He was speaking to Gaming Bolt, by the way, and there's quite a bit of information there that, if you read between the lines, is extremely telling on the PlayStation 4. So I'm first of all going to speak about the API. It's actually quite interesting because of recent comments by a lady by the name of Corinne Yu. Now, of course, she's recently joined the Uncharted development team, also known as Naughty Dog, and she's had extensive, experience, actually, in game engine programming. She's basically a star in it. She worked extensively with 343 Industries, who are, of course, responsible for Halo, and when she basically migrated to Naughty Dog, one of the things that she tweeted was that it was absolutely fantastic to have low-level access to the PS4 and not to have to worry about DirectX any longer. She obviously was not enjoying, even slightly, Windows development, which, to be fair, many are starting to echo. So, if you actually read between the lines, they're actually talking a lot about the API. Now, interestingly, as I've said before, so I'm sure some viewers are familiar with this, but the GPU performance of the PS4 is obviously higher than the Xbox One just out of the gate. It has 20 compute units, but 2 are disabled. So that leaves you 1152 shader processors, and together, that gives you about 1.84 teraflops of computing power, right? But the interesting part is that the API is very low level, much lower level than the average PC, simply because of, well, it uses a very thick abstraction layer known as DirectX. Now, this is something that development teams are trying to get around. For example, AMD, their own R&D labs, are trying to push together Mantle, as I'm sure you're aware. And the PS4 has quite a lot in common with Mantle. So another point that they're keen to emphasize is this allows you to do a lot of optimization, and because it's utilizing a CPU GPU address space that's exactly the same, that's obviously Humor. The principle of this is that both the CPU and GPU can access exactly the same memory address store. Now, I'm sure most of you are aware exactly how Humor works, especially if you're a regular viewer on the channel. I've gone extensively into Humor, but if you're not, I'm going to quickly just go over it, just so no one's left behind. The basic premise is that if you there's 3 models, this is rounding it up and being very general, but there are 3 models of memory, typically. One is, for example, the traditional model, which the PS3 uses, PC as well. Basically, the GPU has its own pool of memory, the CPU has its own pool of memory. So, for example, with PC, it has the graphics card memory and it has main system memory. Now this works okay on a PC for the most part because it has large pools of memory. For consoles it could be a bit of a problem, and it doesn't necessarily facilitate itself well for compute, especially when you compare it to the PS4. Well, the PS4 uses a unified address space, which is heterogeneous unified memory access. Now the basic premise is that with unified memory access, which is what the Xbox 360 uses, sure, it's using exactly the same amount of memory, so it has 512 megs, but the memory can be split up however it wants. So rather than, say, the PS3's model where you have 256 for memory, 256 for graphics, you could split the Xbox 360's memory allocation however you wanted. You could have 400 megabytes for either the graphics or for the CPU. You could have 256, whatever you wanted. But the difference is, although you can kind of adjust the slider, the two pieces of memory are separate. So, in other words, it's kind of like this wall. It's constructed. The difference is the wall can be moved, right? With heterogeneous unified memory architecture, the difference is that basically there is no wall. So you have this pool of memory, in this case 8 gigs, and basically if the CPU wants the GPU to compute something for it, all it has to do is say, hey, you know what, I need your help to handle this piece of data that is at this memory address. So let's say the memory address is 182 and you need to compute that piece of data. It doesn't have to copy that piece of data to the GPU's memory space, it just has to do its thing, which makes it a hell of a lot easier. Now that's obviously very generalized and simplifying it, and I have gone into this a lot more in depth, but I don't want to go into it for those of you who are too familiar with it. So if you're curious, you can always do a bit of Googling, or you can just check out Humor on the channel by simply searching. So anyway, so it's obvious with the Chrome Engine 6, they're already starting to push GPU compute, which of course is going to be very integral, especially with the PS4's beefed up GPU compute architecture. Meanwhile, another developer by the name of Basement Crawl pointed out that their title is going to be running at 1080p, 60 frames per second, hopefully. The chap who was being interviewed, Aaron, pointed out that he didn't have any contact with the Xbox One, so it's hard to compare. However, if you look at the pure numbers, it seems the PS4 is more powerful. Most games run better on the PS4 with higher resolutions and FPS, so I'm pretty sure Sony did a better job in making the game's console. Pure computing power is for sure an important factor for developers, but we should also remember how easy it is to access this power. Overall, the PS4 is a great and powerful tool. Our games are not that demanding on hardware as AAA titles, but we can see how well engineered the PS4 is. So right now, things are a little bit volatile in not only the console, but also the PC space. As I was saying in my video yesterday, there were commenting on NVIDIA's recent interviews and thoughts, let's go with thoughts, on PC gaming space, and their continued push that the PC is the best platform. I think there are a lot of pieces of technology right now that are trying to vie for a good position in the market, and honestly, from the developer's point of view, you're somewhat spoiled for choice. I think one of the problems with the Xbox One, and this is going purely on the comments of developers. I'm not a developer myself in terms of the Xbox One. You know, I know a little bit of programming, that type of thing, but I've certainly not got an Xbox One or development kit available. But from what they are stating, and this seems fairly unanimous, that the Xbox One is finding, well, it is a little bit more tricky, shall we say, to develop for. Although it's fairly strange because CD Projekt Red, just the other day, in another video, they were stating that the actual Xbox One they found easier to develop for, which kind of flies in the face of pretty much every other developer. Now, some developers are stating that the Xbox One isn't that bad to develop for once you understand it. Other people are saying the Xbox One is a nightmare with the ESRAM. Most are saying the PS4 is actually fairly easy. I don't think I've seen anyone, apart from CD Projekt Red, who've said that it's actually a harder platform to develop for. So I'm not quite sure what's going on there. One thing is absolutely crystal bloody clear. These consoles have a lot to learn. I think it's not just a case of, oh, okay, well, we've got GPU compute, so we need to tap into that. I think there's going to be a lot in terms of getting the most out of heterogeneous, or I'm just going to call it humor for the sake of it, shorthand, an acronym, if you will. Well, it is an acronym. I think that definitely pushing humor is going to be integral and vital to the success of the PS4, but I also think there's going to be a lot to do with actually figuring out what works best on compute. I don't think you want a situation where you're just computing everything. I also feel that multi-threading programming right now is maybe not up to as good standards as what we expect. I also feel that Sony themselves are probably still quite early in some of the developmental tools, specifically on, for example, debugging. It's possible they may unlock more memory. There's about 6 gigabytes, just rounding it up, available right now for games programmers, which is fairly reasonable. But if they could, for example, increase that to, say, 7 in the future, that would definitely be good. I think right now we're okay, though. But obviously it's still a little bit early. Definitely we're getting closer, however, to understanding what both consoles are capable of. Definitely some of the PS4's advanced features, for example, the beefed up compute queues, and just the extra ACEs, if you want, asynchronous compute engines inside the PS4, were definitely a very smart move by the PS4 development team, who of course was spearheaded by Mark Cerny. Another thing that I definitely feel that the PS4 is going to benefit from is the volatile bit. I also feel that out of the gate, there's definitely almost kind of a consensus amongst developers that, yeah, the PS4 seems to be easier to program for, which is ultimately what you want. It's the old adage of you want something easy to learn, very hard to master. In other words, you want it easy to begin with, so you could just get into it, but once you understand the basics, then you want plenty to dive into, and the PS4 does seem to do that. It is pretty much, from what we're understanding, that if you're a small team, if you've got, say, 3 or 4 dudes, or, ladies, whatever, working for you, in other words, if you're basically just, a bunch of people working from their bedrooms, then you can easily create a platform game or whatever you need to create, and that's it. You don't have to delve really into GPU compute. I mean, you can do if you so desire, but it's not a requirement. It's not mandatory. On the other hand, if you're a large development team or you have a lot of experience in doing, compute work or graphics engines, that type of thing, then by all means, you've got the facilities to do it. I think it's a very smart move of Sony to just give you the option with the API to allow you to delve in as deeply as possible. From CG Project Red's comments, it seems that Microsoft have got that ability, but they've got it somewhat locked down at the moment. Although their comments weren't exactly 100% forthcoming, so it's possible they've got some NDAs, or maybe they just didn't want to disclose that, some of their opinions on the machines or whatever. It's a little bit tricky, really, to understand, exactly what they were saying, because their comments were so vague in some areas. I mean, if you're curious about them, I've covered it in the CG Project Red video, which was about 2 days ago, so you can just check it out. You can just search CG Project Red, and you can find lots more information. But regardless, I'm going to get going for this particular video. Hopefully you found it somewhat informative, my good friend, and I'll see you soon. Take care. Bye for now.